Sometimes when I do firewood videos where I'm cutting firewood, people make the comment, ask the question, how am I able to cut these rounds in what looks to be uniform lengths without using any kind of gadgets or gizmos to measure them? I'll tell you the story about that. Well, they're not perfect, but I suppose they are fairly close. For those who saw my last video about thinning, this is the tree that had a little bit of sun scald in the top. I mentioned sun scald can cause future defect in the wood. Here's that defect inside the wood where we had that sun scald scar. Not so much a problem for firewood, but after this tree got bigger, it would be a problem for lumber. Not too bad for freehand. My target length, 15 to 16 inches. 15 and almost a half, a little over 15. Well, that one's a little under 15. 15 and 3/4. 15 and a half. A little over 15. Barely 15. Not perfect, but I think very acceptable for firewood. I didn't measure these ahead of time. I didn't mark them. I did it all freehand. No gadgets, no gizmos. But I do have a technique I use for getting the pieces to come out relatively uniform. The way that technique works is to have a dad who's in the firewood business when you're a kid. Start cutting firewood for him at the age of 14, then get a lot of practice between then and now. After that, your pieces should start coming out fairly uniform. I know for a lot of you that train has already left the station. It's already choo-chooed its way halfway past Albuquerque by now. What's halfway past Albuquerque mean? I don't know, but that ship has probably sailed halfway past the Marquesas by now. But I don't know that that means you can't still learn how to cut your firewood rounds fairly uniform in length, freehand. My dad had some techniques he used to teach me how to cut them uniform. I don't know if he realized it at the time, but he was also teaching me some life lessons at the same time. And I'll share those with you now. This was about the time that a lot of people were going from the big barrel stoves we used to use to the smaller box type stoves. A lot of those stoves couldn't handle more than a 16-inch long piece of wood. It wasn't big enough. He had this crazy idea that if you're selling a product to a person, you want to sell them the product that they want. If people want pieces that are under 16 inches, that's what you sell them, which was probably a really smart thing for him to do, but it didn't necessarily fit into my newbie juvenile cutting style, which was not yet calibrated to 15 to 16 inches. When I would go out to cut wood, they would end up random. Wherever the bar of the chainsaw landed, that's how long the wood was, which could be 10 inches or it could be 20 inches, even though I was targeting 15 to 16 inches. My 15 to 16 inch calibrator just hadn't been developed yet. Okay, it probably wasn't that bad. My pieces were probably more in the 14 to 18 inch range. He was okay if they were down to 14. That's not a problem, it's just firewood. If it's too short, they can still fit it in their stoves. But if they were longer than 16, he made me go back, trim the ends off, and make them at least 16 or less. Because if they were more than 16, that doesn't work for a lot of customers. It won't fit in their stove. Going back and trimming all those pieces was not a lot of fun. I did not like it because I had to go back and trim all the pieces that I cut wrong. It gave me incentive to learn how to cut them right. Instead of pulling out a tape measure and measuring each one, what he suggested I do is measure the sole of my boot, which is about 12 inches. Now look at a tape measure and visualize 4 inches. 12 plus 4 is 16. The pieces need to be this much longer than my boot or a little less. It's a lot easier to visualize 4 inches than it is to try to visualize 16 inches. You can do 4 inches more accurately than 16 inches, or at least I can. If I put my heel at the edge of the firewood, I can see what's left over is a little less than 4 inches. As long as that part is a little bit less than 4 inches, that's pretty close to 16 inches, but it's less than 16 inches. So I started cutting firewood this way. measure it with my foot, cut. This was like my training wheels in developing the ability to cut it to the right length freehand. Set my boot on the log with my heel lined up with the last cut. Focus on a point that's a little less than 4 inches in front of my boot. Either keep looking at that spot while I take my boot away, get into position to make the cut, or focus on a distinguishing mark that's in the right spot to make the cut. I would have times where I would do it that way for a while, then I would practice freehand without measuring with my foot. If I notice pieces start looking like they might be too long, I would double check them, just put my boot on them, take a quick look. If they looked like they were starting to get too long again or too short, I'd go back to measuring with my foot for a while until I could feel more comfortable doing it freehand. But throughout the whole process, I would come out with pieces that were too long. I'd have to go back, trim the end off, which just wasn't fun. I asked my dad, well, what if it's 16¼ inches? Is that close enough? He wanted to say yes because it is close enough, but he said, well, if I let you do 16¼ then it'll be 16½, then it'll be 17. We need to nip the bud at 16. They need to be 16 or less. He was not mean about this. It was all done in a respectful way. He was trying to get the product he wanted. I don't know if he realized, or even if I realized at the time, what he was doing was teaching me how to not do shoddy work, how to keep practicing until I get it right. Years later, I found myself on the opposite side of a similar situation. I got into an export business, exporting decorative branches around the world. My customers wanted certain sized branches, so I came up with a crazy idea of giving them the sizes they wanted. In order to do that, I needed my suppliers to bring me branches that were those sizes. I told them I would pay them certain amounts for certain size branches. What would often happen, especially when they're new, they would bring me a load of branches that were random length. Or they would say they cut them extra long so I could cut them down to the size I wanted. In other words, they didn't want to use a tape measure or take the time to measure them. Since they didn't cut them to the length I asked for, now I have to go through 1,200 branches, cut them to the right length. I could have let them get away with that, just give them a stern talking to, tell them next time, please bring me branches that are the right length. But I know what would happen if I did that. If I pay them for the branches that are not the right length, they're just going to continue bringing me branches that are not the right length. I learned that in order to get branches that are the right length, I had to tell them, I'm not paying you for branches until you bring me branches that are the right length. I have learned if you allow people to get away with things, they're going to continue trying to get away with things. After putting up with that little monologue, how about I cut a tree down so you can watch it fall? It's the least I could do. It's just a small one, but that's what I'm doing here. I'm cutting the smaller trees away from the bigger, better trees. I'm going to take this cedar out to give the oak and the other trees some more room. And I'm trying to space the trees out more here to create defensible space for wildfire, create discontinuity between the crowns, so wildfire is less likely to go from one crown to the other. And there are just too many trees here. Since that's such a small one, we'll do a bonus one. This is wider tree spacing than I would normally do if I was thinning out in the woods, but this is more of a situation where I'm making a yard, where I especially want a lot of defensible space for wildfire. Now we have a lot of spacing in between these trees. They will eventually close up the gap. And I wanted to get the slash down here all in one spot so I could burn it with the slash from these other trees all in one shot. Back to the original subject of firewood. I am not in any way trying to suggest there's anything wrong with using gadgets, gizmos, tape measures, whatever you need to use to get your firewood to come out the way you want it. What? It's on wood, it's not in the dirt, it's fine. A lot of people like to measure the log first, mark the places they're going to cut. I do that sometimes too if I'm cutting large rounds. What my dad taught me back then, if you cut a large round that's too long, then split it up into smaller pieces, you're going to have a whole bunch of smaller pieces that are too long. But if you cut that round just right, you'll end up with a bunch of pieces that are just right after you split it. When I am working with large rounds, I will often take the time to measure them or do the boot thing. Obviously, cutting firewood to a uniform length freehand, it's a fun party trick. Kids love it, women swoon over it. But whatever you need to use to get your firewood to come out the way you want it, however you roll, I think that's just fine. Before I go, Alex from AFRI Portable Power Stations wanted me to mention they are having a big sale on their portable power stations. The same one I showed in a video this summer. That one and another one have both been powering my life out here lately with solar panels. These are great for emergency backup, for portable power. I use them every day. 2,400 watts of output, 2,048 watt hours of battery capacity, all kinds of USB and DC outlets, pure sine wave AC outlets. You can charge it by plugging it into an AC outlet, or you can charge it with up to a 500 watt solar panel. Now only $7.99 for this over 2,000 watt hour unit, which has enough power to operate a lot of things. I'll put a link down below in the description with the discount code. I don't know how long this sale's going on, but that's a really good price for a unit with that much power.